to introduce our speaker today, Erin Jones, who's going to be talking to us about the ethical application of LIMA, or least intrusive, minimally aversive, in shelter behavior. Erin is a certified dog behavior consultant and accredited dog trainer with the IAABC, also CPDT, and an accredited animal behavior consultant with Companion Animals New Zealand, which I am not familiar with. And you also have a PhD in human animal studies and a master's in anthrozoology, a bachelor's in psychology and anthropology. So quite an impressive background, Erin, and I'm so excited to have you join us today. And I'm going to turn it right over to you. You can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to share this with you. So bear with me while I get this started here. Okay. Can you see everything okay and hear everything okay before I start? Sorry. Can you see and hear everything okay?
Apologies, I got muted by accident. I muted myself by accident.
Oh, okay.
We have one. I cannot see your screen. Everybody else can see it, though. Is anybody else but me? Can you maybe stop sharing and then share again?
Yep. Okay, I'll try that. 1 second.
It must have been just me for some reason, but just in case.
Sorry, 1 sec. Oh, hang on. Share. Okay, how about now?
Okay, I can see it now. Can everybody else see it? All right, we are good. You can go ahead and get started. Welcome.
Okay. Fantastic. So again, thanks for having me. I'm going to be talking today about the ethical application of LIMA principles in shelter behavior. Oh goodness, what is happening? I think maybe it's like my computer being silly. Okay. Oh, there, it's caught up. It was just
oh no, it's internet.
Okay, no, I think we're good now. I think we're good. Sorry about that. Okay. How embarrassing. Okay, so I just wanted to start with the basics. So LIMA stands for the least intrusive, minimally aversive strategy for teaching and behavior change. Look, we manage and micromanage and really most of the lives of our companion animals. They don't get a lot of free choices. And in order to honor their agency and provide them with some salient choices and to be as non-invasive as we can be, we have to take a critical approach to LIMA, a competency-based guideline, so to speak. I just want to move I've got something in the way here on my screen. And I'm just trying to figure out how to move it.
You should be able to just.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, got it. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, I think we're finally good. LIMA is an ethical guideline. It's a position statement used to ensure that we're taking an animal-centered or a learner-centered approach. So the original mention of LIMA by Stephen Lindsay back in 2000, he basically pointed out that its function was to avoid needlessly using aversive training procedures or to intrude on the dog's freedom incentives. So it's actually left quite intentionally ambiguous to be open to working with each individual rather than to use a specific recipe each time or to go to what's convenient for us or what's worked in the past. So the addition of the Humane hierarchy, or Susan Friedman's Humane hierarchy, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, it can really help us to follow that LIMA framework more accurately by assessing each case in a really systematic way. So LIMA is not ever the justification for the use of any punishment over other effective, less intrusive methods. It's not a justification for the abusive use of pain or fear-inducing tools like prong choke or e-collars. what it is it's a competency-based strategy. It's used to increase the use of positive reinforcement and subsequently decrease the use of punishment, or never to use it to begin with. It provides the learner with choices, and it helps us to consider their agency, as I mentioned, and teaching them skill sets that allow them to thrive in a very human-centric environment that they live in. So the humane hierarchy of behavior change was created 8 years later by Dr. Susan Friedman in 2008, and it's based off of LIMA principles. So it's used as a way to enhance LIMA guidelines. And so the humane hierarchy is a tool designed to help educated behavior consultants and trainers to determine the use of the least intrusive, most effective intervention in a way that's guided by both the behavior research that is out there and ethics as well. The aim of the humane hierarchy is to eliminate our opinion and to eliminate the use of methods simply for their convenience or what might work. So, for example, it might offer an instant gratification to put a bark collar on a barking dog rather than to address the function of that behavior and to evaluate the least intrusive approach. But that's not by any stretch the most humane approach. So we wouldn't take that if we were following the humane hierarchy. So the humane hierarchy offers us an ethical checkpoint. So you've likely seen this roadmap of the humane hierarchy many times before. It's just a really nice, clear illustration. I really like it for that reason. And so we start, I'm just going to pull up my pointer here. We start down here with wellness at the first exit. So that's the first thing that we want to address. And we're going to go through each of these different exits individually throughout the presentation today. And we'll talk about each one individually. So we start here with wellness. That includes everything from physical wellness to mental wellness and nutritional wellness. Then we look at antecedent arrangements. So that's managing the environment in a way that sets them up to be successful. Then we go to positive reinforcement. And then we see there's a little speed bump here at exit 4. So we want to maybe consider why we've ended up there. Have we exhausted these 3 exits already? Is this the best approach for us? And then we get down a little bit further to extinction, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. And we see a yield sign. So we want to be extra cautious if we're going to go down this direction. Critically think about why we want to be here, or why we're here, and what other strategies might be more just as effective, but more humane possibly. And it might be this exit, and we'll talk about that too. And then we've got a full stop sign and a roadblock here when we get to positive punishment. One thing that anyone who follows LIMA needs to understand is how to do a functional behavior analysis. So this provides us with the needed data about the target behavior that we're looking to change or to affect. If we understand that behavior's function, then we can choose the least intrusive, least aversive way to intervene. The function might include attention, access to tangible items, like a reward, for example. It might be fulfilling those inherent sensory needs, or it might be escape or avoidance behavior. So that requires, at the very basic level, that we identify the ABCs. That is the antecedent. So what is cueing or triggering the behavior? And we'll talk more about antecedents in a little bit when we get to the exit for antecedent arrangements. Also, we look at the consequences of that behavior, what the consequence of that target, specifically that target behavior is. If something's good and pleasurable is added, then it's most likely to reinforce or strengthen that behavior. And if it's something aversive that's added, then it's likely to punish or to reduce the behavior. And the behavior is the action that we're seeing, something that we can observe. So it could be anything from sitting to laying down to blinking to lunging to barking. Those are all behaviors. They're all things that we can observe the dog or cat doing. Okay, as I said, we're going to take a moment to talk about each of these exits of the humane hierarchy, the proverbial exits. I don't have a lot of time today, and so I want to just mostly do an overview for you. And this is a topic, I mean, honestly, we could really dive really deeply into if we had the time. And not to shamelessly self-promote or anything, but I am teaching a course on this through the IAABC Foundation. If anyone is interested in learning more about this topic. So our first exit is wellness. So let's explore that. So wellness is all kinds of things, especially in the shelter environment where we may not know their health history or their behavioral history. This should be really the first stop. I mean, it should be the first stop for anybody, but it's definitely an important one. The very best scenario is that we rule something in and we address that issue. So if it's physical pain, for example, maybe we can get some meds on board to help with that. But it also a best case scenario is that we rule something out so that we can understand that there's really no underlying physical issue there. And then we can start with a behavior intervention plan knowing that there's nothing that we're missing that might hinder our progress. And now, to be clear, this isn't all necessarily just things like diseases and pain, though those are definitely up there. The research does tell us that many behavior cases, maybe as many as 80%, have some type of underlying pain comorbidity. But there's lots of things that it can affect behavior, from medications that they're on to emotional disorders, the nutrition, enrichment, all of those things, they all make up wellness for that individual. And everybody's needs are going to be different. Okay, now on to antecedent arrangement. Now, I don't work in a shelter myself, but I would imagine that this is likely going to be one of the most important avenues, but also perhaps one of the most challenging avenues. Now, I completely empathize with the lack of resources and space sometimes, but management is one of those key things to success with any behavior intervention plan. So it might mean getting a little creative sometimes. So an antecedent is one of those things that sets the stage for a behavior to occur. They might be a verbal cue or a visual trigger or a sound. It can be pretty much anything that's happening in the environment, anything that elicits a particular response. And there are two types that we have antecedents that we have. We have distant antecedents, so what's happened earlier in the day to affect motivation. And we have immediate antecedents. So those are the specific cues that happen right before the behavior. Now, sometimes distant antecedents, also referred to as motivating operations, are going to be addressed in that wellness exam or that wellness element that we're exploring. So, for example, chronic pain. But they can also be an ongoing evaluation because they're going to fluctuate. So motivations might be influenced by feeling tired or hungry because they don't want to, or because they went for a long hike that day, earlier that day, and they're tired, or they skipped breakfast that day, so they're feeling hungry. So those can affect the motivation. Immediate antecedents are those triggers or cues, or however you want to word it, that happen directly before the behavior. So the behavior is in response to that immediate antecedent. So in this picture, you see that the people are ringing the doorbell, and I imagine there's dogs on the side barking as soon as they heard this. So this is a great example. The doorbell is the antecedent, and the barking of the dogs on the inside in response to that doorbell is the behavior. And if it's the behavior that we're looking to stop, then we might consider having our guests maybe text on arrival instead, or some kind of alternative like that, where they're not ringing the doorbell. So here's a couple of examples for you just to get you thinking about this. So the phone rings, which is the antecedent, and we answer it, which is the behavior. Or we, if you're like me, you send it to voicemail, which is also a behavior. A person approaches the kennel, which is the antecedent, and the dog barks, that is the behavior. Or the pet, you pet the cat, which is the behavior, or sorry, the antecedent, and the cat swipes your hand, which is the behavior. Okay, so I have just a couple of examples for you here. So instead of having you shout out the answers, I will tell you the answers, but I just wanted to give you some real life examples that you can see in action. Now in this first video, I love it. I think it's a great example, but it might be really hard to see. There's actually a little, not a little person, an actual real size person here. He is wearing an orange jacket. You'll see as we get closer, but he's just swinging a golf ball around. So just to inform you of what that looks like. So we'll watch the clip. Okay, so in that video, the antecedent is the guy playing golf and just something that's occurring in the environment, and the behavior is turning around and looking at me. Okay, so in this next video, so we're not actually talking about any consequences here, which you can see that actually occur in these videos as well. But okay, so in that video, the antecedent was her calling, I don't know if kitten is actually his name, but whatever, that's the recall cue or antecedent, and the behavior is he comes. Got two more here for you. We're looking at the black dog here, not the sleeping dog. So we've got man eating a sandwich. That is the antecedent, and dog rests his chin on the man's arm, which is the behavior. Okay, one more. So we had person knocking on door, which was the antecedent, and dogs bark running to the door and barking, which was the two behaviors. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here given time constraints, but I do want to mention thresholds really quickly. This might be a challenge in a shelter environment where we don't have the ability to create enough space or to adjust the volume, but maybe we can use things like visual barriers or consider sight lines or locations of dogs and cats with particular sensitivities, that kind of thing. So the threshold is sort of the tipping point where a dog can no longer tolerate a trigger before reacting with either escape and avoidance behavior or aggressive type behaviors. So this might mean that we completely remove the antecedent altogether, or like in this example here on my slide, we are working at a distance where the dog is comfortable. So they're okay with this proximity to this person. So we might work somewhere in between here and this threshold line where he starts to really take notice. Hey, there's something I don't like in this environment very much. And we have to always be constantly monitoring body language because these are going to change for a number of reasons. So thresholds can be any of these things, not just visual or volume, but all kinds of factors, really. We really need to identify only that these thresholds exist, meaning that there's something that causes that dog to react in a fearful way, not necessarily the level of tolerance, like volume or proximity. I can't necessarily say, I can maybe give an approximation. My dog is generally good up to about 100 feet of that other dog, but that's going to change. It's not a static thing. It's gonna vary from moment to moment and day to day. And it's a constant evaluation. They're going to wax and wane for various reasons, including those distant antecedents that we talked about. So it could be something like they're experiencing pain, or they're uncomfortable, or they have had several stressful situations already happen earlier in the day, and they're, you know, kind of at their tolerance level is a lot lower than it was maybe yesterday when they had a really fantastic day. So just keep in mind that there is a threshold for a dog who's feeling fearful of a particular thing. So you want to know what that thing is and always be monitoring their body language and making sure that they're trying to keep them always under threshold when possible. One other thing we can do with antecedents is we can arrange them to become cues. So if you think back to that first video that I had, that was actually my dog, the person was the antecedent to her original behavior, which was growling. But instead, I transformed that into an antecedent to have her disengage or turn around and look at me. So remember that a cue can be verbal, visual, or environmental. So in that case, it was an environmental cue. I didn't actually say anything. I was marking her for doing the good choice, for making a good choice in that situation. It was the correct behavior. It was what I was hoping for. But I wasn't actually telling her to do anything. It was just an environmental cue. It might take some other practice before we get there. We might have to do some other methods, maybe some counter conditioning or desensitization practices. So just keep that in mind. We might not be able to just go right into turning a scary situation into a cue and something positive. So it takes time. There's a process to it, but it is something we can achieve a lot of the time. And so what I've done in that case with my own dog, Juno, and with the person as the environmental cue, is I've just replaced that undesirable behavior with a desirable one. So that's what we call differential reinforcement. I've reinforced a different behavior. I've given her a replacement behavior. And we're going to be talking about that next when we get to that exit about differential reinforcement, which is one of our exits. This shows you, though, that these exits aren't always nicely delineated, but learning has a lot of nuances. One point is that worth mentioning is that though some behaviors are really self-reinforcing, and so finding a reinforcer that's better than the original reinforcer for that behavior we're trying to replace might be really, really difficult. So we need to decide if the goal is actually achievable in that situation, or if a different path to antecedent arrangement might be better than doing that cue sort of transfer. So in some situations, maybe just removing the antecedent completely might be the better option. Dog barking at the sight of people walking by the house, close the curtain. That would be removing the antecedent. Okay, next we arrive at positive reinforcement, and I imagine you all know this quite well, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. Just sort of a reminder, I guess. Positive reinforcement is adding a stimulus in response to a behavior that in turn increases the behavior over time. So something that is valuable and motivating to the individual. Reinforcement refers to a strengthening of that behavior. So it's been that behavior has been reinforced. It's like adding support beams to an old dilapidated house. Positive just refers to the addition of the stimulus, something that's pleasurable and that the dog or cat wants. Reinforcement is defined by the learner. So that means if we're using a reward and it's strengthening the behavior, then it's a reinforcer. If it's not reinforcing. Food is generally a great example, and one that I think is very valuable within the shelter environment specifically. So for one, food is a primary reinforcer. It's required for survival and is thus valuable to all animals. If a dog or cat doesn't want food, that's really valuable data that we can use. If that's the case, we need to be asking ourselves why. Is it the right food for the situation? Maybe it's not valuable enough for the requests that we're giving them. Or are they over their threshold level? Maybe they're not taking treats is a good indicator that they're really stressed or they're fearful or they're anxious, because we don't ever want to usually eat in that situation. Or maybe they have an underlying condition, and if they're feeling unwell, they're also not going to want to take treats. So it's good information to have if they're not taking treats. However, with healthy animals, treats can be a really awesome reinforcement because they can be delivered really quickly. And we know that timing can be key for successfully using positive reinforcement. But also in a shelter, we may have limited time with each dog. So food allows us to practice and repeat behaviors during a limited, maybe 10-minute session, and accomplish a lot more in a short amount of time that we might have with each individual. Positive reinforcement has lots of applications. We can use it to shape behaviors, to capture all those great choices they're making, and even put that under stimulus control if we want to. And we can use it to lure a position that we want when we're teaching a new behavior, with the caveat that the lure should be faded within a couple of trials. So we don't want it to become the behavior to become reliant on that food or reinforcer. We can also use it to strengthen and maintain learned behaviors on various different schedules of reinforcement. And we can even use it to teach replacement behaviors, which we'll be addressing next. At the next exit, I mean, not on the next slide. It's worth noting that there are several studies that indicate that the use of positive reinforcement over other more aversive methods create more reliable behaviors, and that is better for the trust needed in a strong and safe relationship. It can lead to better, more successful long-term outcomes, and it can reduce the risk of any fallout associated with the use of punishment or negative reinforcement, which we'll talk to when we get to those sections, what that follow might look like. Just a quick note, though, that just because we're using treats or reinforcers doesn't mean that we're automatically absolved from being coercive necessarily. We can be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that immediately. So for example, or a couple examples, first, if the stakes are too high and we're using food and offering it, and it's a really valuable like food offer, for example, a piece of steak for doing something that they would never want to pass up, they may end up doing something that makes them really uncomfortable just because they really want that piece of bacon or steak. That's not to say that we should never use highly valuable rewards, but we just need to be mindful that they get highly valuable food at other times too, not just when we're asking for that specifically hard behavior, and that we're not putting them into uncomfortable positions to get that reinforcement. So we want to make sure we're taking our time to shape a behavior properly. It's a bit like offering you $1 million just to take a swim alone with baited great white sharks. I mean, it's a lot of money. I'd consider it for a second, but it's probably not a wise choice. And I'd probably feel pretty uncomfortable when I was there. Food, toys, space, attention, all these things we're using for reinforcement. If we're only offering these items, if they perform, then that's also coercion. We want to make sure they have our love, our attention, food when they need it, and that we're not depriving them of food so that we can get them to perform in a certain way. So we want to make sure we're avoiding deprivation. And we want to avoid bribes as well. Reinforcement always comes after the behavior, not before. And as we move to a variable reinforcement schedule down the road, that behavior will be successfully maintained and not become dependent on the presentation of food. Okay, so our next exit is differential reinforcement, which I've mentioned several times already. So hopefully you have some idea of what it is. Differential reinforcement is all about behavior change, but without the use of punishment. So what we do is we instead replace an old behavior with a new one. It means we have to reinforce the new positively reinforce the new behavior using something more reinforcing than what was maintaining the old behavior. And in order to do this, you'll need to evaluate the function of that behavior. So we need to do our functional analysis. The second part of differential reinforcement is withholding or a lower rate of reinforcement for that old behavior that we're aiming to replace. However, with the use of antecedent arrangements, we aim to really prevent them from doing that old behavior in the first place, if we can help it. So we want to essentially set them up to be successful by making that old behavior just obsolete and maybe even more difficult than the new behavior, and the new behavior the ideal choice and also more reinforcing. So these are the most common types of differential reinforcement that we'll see in animal training. Differential reinforcement of another behavior is the first one, and it involves positive reinforcement in the absence of the undesired behavior. So reinforcement of a different behavior during a fixed period of time. So my example here is puppy mouthing. So the reinforcement happens maybe every 5 seconds, regardless of what the behavior is, as long as it's not the behavior we're looking to replace. So they can be doing literally anything as long as they're not biting. Differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior uses positive reinforcement to reinforce a behavior that cannot occur physically at the same time as the undesired behavior. So for example, teaching a door dashing cat to station on the top of the steps when the door opens. They can't physically run out the door and station on the step. Differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior uses positive reinforcement of a new behavior to serve as an alternative to the undesired behavior. So for example, teaching a dog who barks at house guests to instead station on a mat. Technically, he can still bark, but we're just trying to give him something new to do that's more reinforcing. I think especially in a shelter where there are likely going to be more than one person working with that learner, that we have a really strong plan in place. And this is just an outline of what that might look like. So first we have identifying the behavior that we want to replace, and then choosing reinforcers that are valuable enough to be motivating to that individual. Might be doing a preference test for that individual and seeing what they really value. Then we collect some baseline data. Now, of course, you may not have a whole lot of time with that individual if they're only going to be there for a week or two. So maybe this data is just gathered over one day or one outing or 1 or 2 outings. It's just really a starting point so that we are able to track their progress. And then we want to figure out what type of differential reinforcement will work best in that situation. Remember that management of antecedents are still needed here so that they're not rehearsing the behavior that we're aiming to change. So for an example, differential reinforcement of another behavior might work really well for a dog who chews a leash when they're out for a walk with their handler. But that might not be a great option if the behavior is something that they're doing when people aren't around, such as barking at in their kennel. And that if that's the behavior we're looking to change, that's probably not a good option for them. So you want to create a plan step by step that's clear enough for each person to see where you are in the plan and what they need to be doing, and collecting data as you go so that you can evaluate if that plan is working or if you need to make adjustments. So here's just a quick example of replacing the behavior of jumping up on a person with another behavior, which is stationing on a mat. And I want you to think of whether this is a DRI, a DRO, or a DRA.
Mister, Matt. Yes.
So because laying down on a mat makes it impossible for him to jump up on a person, this would be a differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. So this could be generalized to when they have house guests come over, and instead of running over and jumping on them, he goes and directly lays on his mat. A key to successful differential reinforcement is identifying the function of the undesired behavior. All behavior occurs because it works for that individual. Either the learner gets something that they want, so a tangible thing, something like attention or sensory experience, or they are escaping something that they don't want, so like a demand or attention or unpleasant sensory experience. So your differential reinforcement procedure depends on correctly identifying the function of that maladaptive or undesired behavior. Differential reinforcement helps us to avoid using punishment, and it provides the learner with the information about what they should be doing in that particular context. So rather than just saying, nope, that's not right, nope, don't do that, which is really not very helpful, we're actually providing them with a skill. Okay, so things that we use in extenuating circumstances are extinction, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. Sometimes shelter environments are those extenuating circumstances, as we'll see with my example in a few minutes. But if you ever take this avenue, the goal is still to do so with the least aversive use of those methods, and to eliminate the need to use these methods, moving to a less intrusive method as quickly as possible. Just a little side note, do be mindful that aversives don't always just live here in this category and above. Lots of things can be potentially aversive, hence why we aim to be minimally aversive. So for example, if I'm working on a fun new training task with my dog, and that training session ends, that can be aversive to her if, we're just done and everything stops, no more treats, no more reinforcement, everything ends. That can be aversive to some dogs, and it's definitely to my dog. She really enjoys those sessions and the food reinforcer very much. So I need to come up with ways to better transition from reinforcement activity to non-reinforcement activity without being aversive, or being as least aversive as I can. However, I'm not using that to modify her behavior. So it is just something that is part of that process that I need to be able to consider to be less aversive. Okay, first up, we have negative reinforcement. This is when we remove an undesirable or unpleasant stimulus in order to actually reinforce, so increase that behavior. That means there has to be something unpleasant in the first place. Learning that happens is either going to be escape or avoidance learning. So they do something in either to escape or to avoid that negative stimulus or that unpleasant stimulus. So we often think of certain things as being aversive, painful things or really unpleasant things like a pinch collar, for example. But remember again that like positive reinforcers, negative reinforcers also are defined by that learner. I thought this was a relevant example. And if you're interested in reading the whole article, you can find it by visiting the IAABC Foundation website and clicking on the journal tab. All the issues of the journal are open access to everyone, and this article is in issue 18. So to give you a summary of this example of using negative reinforcement in the shelter environment, this program was designed for extremely fearful, very under-socialized or completely unsocialized cats to help them to gain a pro-social interest in interacting with humans. Because we talked previously about thresholds, this is a really great example. Even just the sight of people at all was aversive to most of these cats. So this made positive reinforcement not a very viable first option. I mean, they couldn't even really get close enough to deliver any positive reinforcement to these cats. So instead, they started with negative reinforcement. And as we'll see in a moment, they were able to then work their way close enough that they were able to then switch to using positive reinforcement. So what they did is they started with the person situated as far away as possible from the cat's kennels, and they'd simply wait for any desirable behavior. And often this was as simple as a blink. And when they did that, the trainer would leave for 20 minutes. So remember, negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus. And these cats found people to be aversive. So the cats learned that they can control the person's departure, and the trainers were able to slowly start approaching the kennels more and more and decrease the proximity. And once they were able to approach the kennels at a reasonable distance, they could then start to deliver treats, and they could switch to using positive reinforcement. And they did that as quickly as they possibly could. So that's a really good example of why you might use negative reinforcement as a starting point in that situation. You don't have a lot of control over your antecedent arrangements there either. And perhaps you have limited resources, and you need to make change as quickly as possible so you can get those cats out of that environment and into a home, hopefully. Next, we have negative punishment. Now, I see this used a lot with dogs who jump up on people. They stop paying attention and they ignore the dog. And this will rarely, if ever, work, honestly, and is much more likely to just cause that dog frustration. It's really not great practice, but it's something that is still used all the time. So it's when we take away a reinforcer, we're taking away our attention, we're taking away an expected treat, we're taking away freedom to space. So timeouts, for example, those are all examples of negative punishment. So here's another example for you, puppy mouthing. Puppies mouth, that's what they do. And when the puppy does that, you leave or you withdraw your attention, and the idea is that the removal of the reward, so you playing with them or them getting to mouth you, will decrease the behavior. Though we often just see dogs or puppies that become frustrated and then just do other undesirable behaviors because they haven't been given any information about what we want them to do. So a better alternative to this is first to manage the puppy, so antecedent arrangements, so that we're reducing or eliminating the mouthing altogether. Also teaching alternatives alternative behaviors to that puppy, or redirecting them to appropriate items and providing them with appropriate outlets, meeting the excuse me, meeting their needs. And the last one in this on this exit is extinction, which means that we are not reinforcing a behavior anymore that was previously reinforced. So connection seeking barking is a really great example of this. A puppy cries in her crate, and this has resulted in being let out of her crate, which she found really reinforcing. Now the person has decided that they're just never going to let her out, and she can cry it out in an effort to reduce the crying. Well, this is really not good practice either for a few reasons. One, the puppy is needing something and we're completely ignoring those needs. Two, this can be shaped using positive reinforcement. And three, this can be managed using antecedent arrangements. Maybe we switch to things like baby gates or pens, or switching the location. There's a lot of things that we can try to reduce her negative feelings about being essentially confined to a space. When we use extinction, we will also see an extinction burst. And this is when the behavior will temporarily increase right after we remove that reinforcement. So like when the button opened the elevator door before, but now it isn't opening, we press that button harder and faster. It's that same idea, right? Like, hey, this used to be really great. What's happening? I'm going to try more. I'm going to try harder. Spontaneous recovery will also likely happen. And this is the difference between this and an extinction burst is that the extinction burst happens right after we take that reinforcement away. Whereas the spontaneous recovery happens after extinction. So if you look at this graph here, or this diagram here, we have our baseline, it's being reinforced, it's great, it's being maintained. Then we take away the reinforcement. We're gonna say, okay, we're gonna try to eliminate this behavior. We're never gonna reinforce it again. And the behavior gets worse and worse and worse. This is our extinction burst. Then it starts to decline until it's extinct. And it's extinct for a little while, and then, oh, it comes back. Hey, I'm going to try that again. That worked for me in the past. I'm going to try it again. And usually this might happen 1 or 2 or 3 more times. It could happen at any time, which is why extinction isn't the greatest option, because spontaneous recovery can happen. It's never really gone. That behavior's never really gone. So there are lots of ethical considerations for using any aversives in training, and we'll go through those ethical considerations of each of those 3 that I just talked about. And these include things like the potential that it can cause flooding, the animal shuts down, they feel unsafe, and they can associate unpleasurable experiences with other things in their environment, including the people that are handling them. It can also be coercive, and there's a high risk of behavioral fallout, including aggressive behaviors. So when a dog is feeling threatened or fearful, they are much more likely to act in aggressive ways, particularly if they are feeling like they don't have an option to flee. And that can not necessarily just be a leash. It could be their environment that they're in a kennel environment or a shelter environment. There's not a lot of escape routes. Now, this is just one example of many studies that highlight this point. They conclude that the use of aversive-based teaching methods pose a welfare risk, essentially because it increases stress, pessimism, and they spend more time in tense states. So just like I said in the last slide, if they're feeling fearful, they're feeling threatened, and I mean, we don't get to decide what threatened looks like. They might feel threatened for a variety of reasons. But we want to understand that if they're feeling that way, that they're more likely to behave aggressively. Now, the ethical considerations of negative punishment is the negative punishment is the removal of something the animal wants. which can also be aversive. It doesn't provide them with any information about what we want them to be doing. And extinction, when evaluating the ethical use of extinction, we see like the cry it out example, that we risk ignoring their very real needs. Without the use of differential reinforcement alongside extinction, it also doesn't provide the learner with information about what behaviors we want. And furthermore, the initial function of the now extinct behavior might manifest in new ways or spontaneously recover. So the crying might stop, and something like chewing or destructive behavior might take its place. Last stop is positive punishment. We notice there's a roadblock, there's a stop sign there. There's a lot to consider if we find ourselves here. Positive punishment is adding an aversive stimulus to reduce the behavior from occurring. Needs to be applied pretty accurately and severely to really be effective. An example is the leash pop. I see this one a lot when I'm out with my own dog and I see people walking around. Very common faux pas. In order for it to actually reduce the pulling, the caregiver has to check the collar hard enough that it needs to be aversive. And if that's the case, then the behavior will reduce over time. But like reinforcers, aversives are also defined by the learners. So that leash pop might be traumatic for some dogs, but it might be just annoying to other dogs. And then we just escalate that. Now, this list is not exhaustive. There's a lot to consider if we end up here at positive punishment. So the intensity needs to be right for it to not just be annoying, frustrating, or abusive. Often dogs will habituate to, say, our yelling, and then we end up starting to yell louder, and we might start throwing in some actions. Some dogs may never find yelling aversive enough and so we risk elevating that aversiveness more and more over time. That also goes with the consistency and latency. It's hard to maintain a behavior with aversives. I think the biggest things that are with this are the potential for their abuse, learner confusion and frustration, and reducing feelings of safety, operating under a threat that the aversive could come at any time, and they're powerless to control that. I kind of glossed over that. I am aware what time it is, so I just want to wrap up really quickly, let you know that if you're interested in learning more, the IAABC Foundation has all kinds of fantastic courses, everything from 1-hour webinars to extensive taught courses and or self-study courses as well. My upcoming course on the ethical application of LIMA and the humane hierarchy to behavior cases is also coming up. Details about it will go over the details about the application of LIMA and the humane hierarchy, the ideas to give you critical thinking strategies, and discussions about the ethical considerations of each of those strategies, and look at some case studies. So thank you so much, and I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. This was super interesting.